Another for the rich, another for the poor. And
Now, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're broadcasting on over 800 stations on Pacifica and NPR and low-power FM and college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations and both TV satellite networks, on Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on Direct TV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines also available in Spanish for any radio station to take, as over 250 are. We're talking with Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist, professor at Columbia University. His latest book is called Freefall: America, Free Markets, and the Sinking of the World Economy. Juan?
Well, Joe Stiglitz, one of the things that intrigued me about your book was the effort that you did to look at the historical the historical development that preceded this Great Recession of 2007, 2008. You actually trace the origins of some of the aspects of the crisis back about a decade to what was happening in the Third World, especially in Asia, all of the countries that experienced crises in 1997, 1998, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. And it reminded me very much that people forget that the Great Depression of the 1930s was actually preceded by an enormous crisis in the Third World in the 1920s, that if people had been looking would have told them what was about to happen here in the United States. Now, you had a front row seat in that because you were involved with the World Bank back then. Could you talk about what happened in the late 90s and its relationship to the current crisis?
There are actually two connections. One of them is that we were seeing played out around the world the consequences of the kinds of deregulation, financial market deregulation that had begun in the United States and around the world in the era of Reagan and Thatcher. In the quarter century before that, the world had experienced the first extended period in which there was no financial crisis since the beginning of capitalism. Financial crises had happened over and over and over again. And after the Great Depression, we passed a set of regulations in the United States and similar ones in other countries that at last have provided an element of financial stability. We had stopped the banks from engaging in the excesses that had repeatedly marked their behavior. We forgot those lessons. We deregulated. Unfortunately, the World Bank and the IMF were at the forefront of that in the days and the years before I arrived. And the result of that was that there were literally more than 100 financial crises around the world in the period after the deregulation movement began. And the consequences were really serious. I saw, for instance, Indonesia, in the central island of Java, the unemployment rate got up to 40%. You know, I can remember people saying, you know, we're so much smarter than we were back in the Great Depression. We know how to prevent another recession of that depth. But we were as smart then as we are now, and the right policies were not put into place, and Indonesia went into this really serious depression. The second link is a forward-looking link. Because of the way the U.S. Treasury and the IMF managed those crises around the world, the policies they pushed on these countries, the economic downturns turned into recessions, recessions turned into depressions. I talked to the prime minister of one of these countries, and he said, quite frankly, we were in the class of '97. We saw what happens if you don't have enough reserves. And then he went on to say, you know, we'll never let this happen again. And he and countries all over the developing world started to save. They started to build up reserves, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Now, this led to greater security for them, but it has contributed to a global problem. If people aren't spending, there's a lack of global aggregate demand, a lack of spending that will sustain the global economy. In a world of globalization, it is global aggregate demand that matters a great deal. So what we are now seeing, and we're likely to see in the future, is that this problem already serious is going to get worse, because the countries that did better in this crisis were the countries that had built up the most reserves. China has built up reserves of over $2.3 trillion. Yeah, it's a huge amount of money. China is the one country that never went into recession. Growth did slow down from about 12% down to 7–8%, maybe for some quarters even lower than that, but it's back to 9%. It could do that because it had these huge reserves. So the lesson the countries are learning is save, don't spend, and of course, if the countries follow that lesson, then the global recovery will be very anemic.
Coming forward to today, Joe Stiglitz, I wanted to turn to President Obama in his State of the Union address, who called for a freeze on government spending, except, well, notably in relation to spending on war. The record $3.8 trillion budget Obama unveiled the following week boosts money for war while cutting domestic spending. This is what he said.
Starting in 2011, we are prepared to freeze government spending for 3 years. Spending related to our national security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will not be affected. But all other discretionary government programs will. Like any cash-strapped family, we will work within a budget to invest in what we need and sacrifice what we don't. And if I have to enforce this discipline by veto, I will.
That was President Obama in his State of the Union address. Your assessment of this, you're also author with Linda Bilmes of the $3 trillion war. What about the costs of war and the spending freeze and everything but war?
Well, first, wars are very expensive, and that was the point that Linda and I made in our book, that much of the cost of the war is beneath the ground, dishonest accounting, costs that we're going to have to pay, for instance, for disabled, the fraction of those fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan that are coming back disabled is enormous. It's now almost 1 out of 2, and many of these disabilities are very, very serious, and we are going to be paying these costs for a half-century going forward. So we should remember that these costs are larger than the costs that they're admitting to. But going back to the basic economics of what we're talking about here, 2 points I'd make. The first is a point that Linda and I made in our book, and that is spending on the war is spending that does not stimulate the economy. It provides the least bang for the buck in terms of the economy of almost any other kind of spending. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we've used large numbers of foreign contractors. Money that's spent over there doesn't have a second round of effects back at home. What we count on when we spend money in other areas is that we spend the money, the people who receive the money spend the money, that creates more jobs, and then they spend the money, and that round, that circulation of the money around keeps building up. But if we spend the money over on war costs, we don't get those kinds of indirect benefits. Secondly, unlike other kinds of spending on investments, on education, infrastructure, technology, we don't get extra tax revenues from the extra growth. When we spend money on these other areas, the economy grows. When the economy grows, tax revenues increase. It's reflecting the same kind of short-sighted behavior, perceptions that got the country into trouble in the first place. It's not the national debt today that matters. It's the national debt 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. If we spend the money well and that creates a stronger economy, that will create more tax revenue. And just like a firm borrows to make profits in the future, it makes perfect sense for us to borrow to create jobs today and to get more tax revenues in the future, and our national debt will actually be lower if we spend more money now. Well, the final point, the President...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to emphasize the point. The jobs problem is much more serious than the president seems to realize. We're not going to be out of this by 2011, 2012. Even the administration, the CBO, have said unemployment in their, I think, optimistic projections is not going to get back to normal, at least into the middle of the decade. So the timing here is also off.
Well, Joe Stiglitz, you've also